What can kingfishers and bullet trains teach us about communication? In the 1990s, the Japanese engineers for the bullet train had a problem. The bullet train is one of the fastest trains ever made, but they were encountering this issue when it went through tunnels. Because it would go so fast, when it went through these tunnels, it would create this massive pressure release and it created this big loud boom. It was really noisy. It was violating all kinds of sound limits and it was becoming an issue. And they were looking at ways to try to go, how can we make it quieter? How can we make it, create less of a noise when it goes through? And, they tried doing a typical engineers thing. They went kind of to first principles, looked at physical principles, see what they could do, weren't really getting anywhere. And then one day, one of the engineers happened to be an avid bird watcher, and he watched a kingfisher bird dive from a branch into the water, and he noticed as it went through, it made barely a splash at all. And being an engineer, he realized that means the pressure difference was tiny. And what he ended up doing is he looked at the kingfisher and he looked at the shape of the kingfisher's beak and realized this was perfectly shaped and designed to minimize pressure differences. The result was he then went back, re-engineered the bullet train. They made the front of the train look like a beak, and suddenly the issue disappeared. And not only did they get rid of this noise, but it actually became about 15% less. It needed 15% less electricity and got even faster. So the point of this is what this evolved into what's called biomimicry. It was an emerging field in design where instead of going, doing what most of us do, which is we find a problem and we try to go, well, let's break it down to like first order principles and look at the components and see if we can come up with logical solutions. That doesn't always work. Biomimicry goes, well, this problem might have been solved in the natural world already, and it looks for natural solutions because we can try to break things down logically, but with, thousands and millions of years of evolution, nature often has stumbled onto very, very effective solutions for these problems. And if we can take that, then we can actually get a solution without having to do all the hard work and thinking, and often get better solutions as well. Another example of this is mosquitoes, and actually researchers have been looking at mosquitoes proboscis to try and design less painful needles, because a mosquito happens to have evolved to try to puncture your skin without you even noticing. And looking at the shape of that has actually improved needle design, so needles are less painful for people as well. Anyway, what has this got to do with communication? Well, I think that we as practitioners and as chiropractors have a lot to learn from these examples here. And actually we can use a biomimicry approach when it comes to actually educating our patients. Let me give you an example. The way most of us approach education is we think that I have this information in my head and I want to get it into the patient's head, whether that is a treatment plan that I'm recommending, whether that is, what my adjustments are actually doing or why we actually need to, get them to change their lifestyle, all these sorts of things. And we do what most of us do, which is we go into logic and we go, I'm going to logically explain what this is doing in a way that makes sense. I'm going to break it down, get rid of the jargon, give it in simple patient terms. And that way they'll hear it, they'll understand it, they'll know what I want them to know, and they'll probably make the kind of choices that we're trying to encourage, right? Well, if you've done this for a while, you know that it often doesn't work as well as it should. You can have the best logical examples in the world. A lot of the time, that doesn't work. And what we're doing here is we're trying to take a very logical approach to communication. We're going, well, I want to communicate this. How would I break it down into simple things and then build that back up into something that would work? That's a lot like the engineers looking at the bullet train going, well, how can we break the train down and create more of a difference? Instead, I would argue we should be looking at the natural world, because it turns out human brains have evolved over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, to absorb information a certain way, and it's not logical. We did not evolve to memorize sets of facts. We did not evolve to learn through being given things didactically, being just handed information there as well. We actually evolved to learn through stories. And there are arguments that actually language evolved as a way to tell better stories. There's a fantastic podcast I listened to years ago about a group of people who were mute and they didn't have any concept of language. They were all living together and they had basically invented their own form of language. They were miming things and they had to mime, to actually communicate these things through. And they were basically telling stories about what happened through mime. Even before language, this is something we were likely doing, and we evolved to learn through stories. This is why the idea of sitting around a campfire and telling stories is a very, very primal one. That's how the human brain designed to learn. You can remember the plot of a movie you saw years and years ago, when I bet you couldn't remember a single other fact about the day you went to see it, unless it happened to be your birthday or something really unusual happened. So we memorize stories far, far better. And that's something that we should be doing with our patients. It's why the approach I teach to a report of findings, it's what I call the 3-act report of findings. It's using a story framework. But a simpler example, you can use this with anything you're trying to get a patient to understand. Rather than telling them, you should do this, tell them a story. Don't try to give them the facts there. Tell them a little story about how you had a patient who was struggling with a similar thing to them, and maybe they'd encountered the same things. And yeah, they were finding that it kept waking them up at night too, and it was really bothering them. And they tried different things. And you know what they found in the end? They found that actually, if they did this set of stretches, a 3-minute routine before they went to bed, then they actually found out they were waking up in the morning feeling refreshed and feeling better. Or they found that actually, you know what, if they didn't, go and sit down for hours and hours, but they actually set a little timer to remind them to get up more often, by the end of the day, suddenly they weren't getting these headaches. It can be whatever example you want. But don't say, you should do this and here's the logical reason and here's what's happening in the body and inflammation. That stuff's useful for the right patient. Most people don't want to know it, don't learn that way, and won't retain it. Instead, you want to look at biomimicry. This is how we evolved to learn. We want to do that through stories. So the next time you're thinking of a patient, you're trying to get a point across, you're trying to give them some education, help them to understand something, don't give them to facts. Think about a story. Think about a time where you saw somebody and this was useful for them. Tell that story instead. And then at the end, if you want to just underline it a bit, go, what do you think of that? Give it a try with the next patients. I promise you it will go much, much better for you than simply trying to educate and cram information in there.